what I'm going to do today is a very generic, this morning, is a very generic overview. I'm not going to get too much into the math, so I'm not really going to get into math at all. But I'm going to give an overview of modern quantitative genetics-driven breeding. Make sure that everybody's more or less roughly on the same page, so just to get started slowly. And then this afternoon, one is going to start into the starting to the specific topic, starting the trial design, and then moving on to trial analysis. So this is some suggested reading. I've got the books here. This is not homework for tomorrow, but these are useful guides you could have to quantitative genetics. So this book is my favorite introduction to statistics. It's some of you are probably familiar with this. I find it much clearer, simpler, and more straightforward than maybe many of the old style statistics textbooks that take you through. I've got it right here. And this book also, it's pretty thin, and it guides you also not just in traditional statistical approaches, but this covers everything, including many of the methods that underlie machine learning and artificial intelligence approaches. The basics of it are explained simply and clearly in this book. So I recommend it. It's also available free online, and the exercises are available in R or Python, so you can choose your poison there. And it's also available in several different languages. So I know, for example, this textbook is available in Chinese, which might be useful for some of you, and several other languages. Okay. That's statistics. Quantitative genetics. Rex Bernardo's book here is, and if you want to come and, I'll leave these at the front if you want to come and look and decide whether to buy things. This is not free, but it's a really good introduction to quantitative genetics in breeding, written by a breeder very clearly and straightforwardly. Falcon and McKay is the classic textbook to quantitative genetics that we all have on our bookshelf. If you want to read, to understand in depth the core basis of the quantitative genetics models that we use, this is the basic textbook. But it's not, I would say, compared, this is an easy read. This is probably something you shouldn't read before bed. It's a bit more dense and all-encompassing. This is the core. This includes a lot more detail. This is volume 1. I don't have volume 2, but I know Fernando has it. If you want to maybe bring it in tomorrow, you could have a look at volume 2. Each volume takes taken about 20 years to produce. Volume 3 is going to happen in about 15 years' time, but this is a very comprehensive and detailed look at quantitative genetics. And I don't know, Juan, do you have any other book recommendations that people would do? Or have I covered it?
There are several books, of course. Hinkelman, for example, had 3 chapter books which they discuss almost all experimental designs.
Oh yeah, I missed experimental design though.
They're a very good book because you can find almost any experimental design on it.
Have you got that book in your talk?
No, I don't talk about books.
Well, maybe stick it at the start and then people can find out. I just put the website where I've taken some of the figures as well. So we've been, Excellence in Breeding is a CGIAR project developing recommendations for breeding programs in CGIAR. So Excellence in Breeding is broader than this data analytics, but the analytics part of this, there's quite a lot of simulations and useful, results of simulations, but also the code if you want to do your own simulations and code for various other analyses, all included in the toolbox of this website. And I'll use some examples from there in my talk now, but that's a useful source of information as well. Okay. So let's get started on, I apologize. For those of you who were here at Science Week, CIMMYT Science Week last week, you'll know that it's a really fantastic spreading opportunity for disease. So I might have to pause now and then. Okay. So, I'm going to go talk about the core steps of a breeding program. I mean, it's very simple. You're all familiar with this. We generate some variation. We make some crosses. We generate some variation. We evaluate. I'm going to try this with the pointer. So Simit's pointer has got the collection of the smallest laser pointers in. We evaluate that variation. We select the best variants, and we use those variants either to recycle as parents in the next generation, or to develop a product, which is a variety. In what we might call a more traditional breeding program, this was roughly what happened. You did lots of different stages of testing, and right at the end, maybe not the product itself, but something very close to the product was used as a parent. So you're going to work through a lot of testing, find really the best 1 or 2 lines, and then use those as parents and products. In a modern breeding program, the concept has changed a bit. So what we're trying to do in a modern breeding program is recycle the parents as soon as possible before going through all these stages. As soon as possible means when we think we have enough information to make a good decision, we do it. We don't wait till the end. Okay? This could be, in an ideal world, we might do this after 1 stage of yield testing, but it might be good. There may be a reason to go to a stage 2 or later, but basically the idea is to go as quickly as possible. So then we break the breeding program into 2 parts. The recycling part, which is a cycle, which is population improvement. So we have a set of germplasm, that's our breeding germplasm, and we're trying to improve that material rapidly through cycling. And when we're thinking about this, we make an assumption that this is more or less a closed population. So we're not making lots of groups. We're not making lots of crosses from external material. 90% of our crosses are going to be within this cycle. And then we separate out the product development as a separate process. Okay. Any question? I think so this session, please ask any questions as we go. The idea is everybody's on the same page, understanding, and they might and can feed back into what I'm talking about. So now we have, from this viewpoint, a population improvement cycle and product development. This is another way of showing it. We've got a turning wheel, cross-test select, and releasing products, either every year, every 2 years, whatever is most appropriate. So, I meant this to be interactive. Why should we separate population improvement from product development? So has anybody got any suggestions of why that might be a good idea?
Okay. I think that it's still the idea of being efficient on the recycling, being focused on the recycling and developing a new variant. And when we mix everything, we will tend to wait for the product and the recycle. It will be like the traditional breeding program. And that's why it has to be separate and have to focus on the different parts.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yep, that's a good point.
We need to separate them because for product development, it's better we to evaluate the test process and recycle the lines. But in the case of PVs, we need to do recurrent selection. We cannot accumulate more the frequency of groups. And so we need to separate them.
Yeah, thanks. That's the first point I had on the slide. And this is, and that was very clearly explained there. So, the summary is, in any simulation or even just basic modeling, recurrent selection is always more efficient than selecting more intensely in a single generation, and we achieve an extra generation of recombination doing that. So there's a time element, like you were saying, and there's an efficiency element in terms of recurrent selection. So this was just something I put together yesterday to show a 2 versus 1 step. So we're trying to, so this is a 2-step selection process here. We start out with a trait mean value of 5, and we select the best 10%, which is like typically what you do in a breeding program to be parents of the next generation. The trait has a heritability of 0.5. So our aim is to shift this mean of this population to the right. And if we do it in 2 steps, we select 10% here. We grow a new population that's got a mean that's got up to, I can't remember what it was now, 5 point something. And then we select again, the top 10%, and then we say, you know, given this heritability, what's the mean that we've achieved in this 2-step process, okay? And then what I did is then I said, well, what if we tried to do this in one go, instead of doing it in a recurrent step where we build on the previous generation? What would the area we have to select look like? And can you see here this teeny tiny little red thing? Okay. It's about 0.3%. So if you need to have 20 parents in the next generation, well, here we've done, you know, we've selected 10% and 10%, that's pretty reasonable to get to that 20 parents, but here we have to have an enormous number of, test enormous number of lines to get 0.3% of the total selected as parents. You need 20 parents. We have a vast number of lines. We've expended a huge amount of resources here when we could have done it much more simply in 2 steps. It's always better to do recurrent selection than try and push really intensely. And I'll explain the underlying reason for that a bit more mathematically in a few slides when we come to selection intensity. But that's the first principle. Okay. Recurrent selection is always more efficient. As soon as you can, you try to recycle the parents for the population improvement. And as soon as you can is when you have enough information to do it in a sensible way. So it is about speed, but essentially it's really about, it's speed with efficiency. Okay. There's another reason to separate population improvement from product development, another main one other than the 2 we've heard. Anybody got any more ideas on that? Okay, this one is a bit more subtle. So I've highlighted best here. So we're selecting the best variant, okay? And we want to develop the best product and we want to cycle the best variant parents. These are not always the same. Well, sorry, I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. What we've just said, cycles of recurrent selection allow us to concentrate favourable alleles in the population, as you said, to increase the mean genetic value of the population for all traits of value to the breeder. So we looked at one trait in the previous slide, but now if we look at all traits, our overall aim is not just so we do want to concentrate the favourable alleles, but it's the genetic value of the population for all traits. And as I said before, we're assuming a largely closed population. Does everybody understand what I mean by largely closed? So you're taking your parents from within the population. So the quantitative genetics model that underlies all of the modern QG breeding, and Fernando is going to explain a lot more about this on Friday. That model is about increasing the mean genetic value. That's the focus of the model. In theory, the model is infinite alleles, and each allele has an infinitely small effect. But this is a way of thinking about what we're doing when we're doing this recurrent selection. So imagine, so this is a very simplified example. We have 3 traits, the green, red, and the blue, and we have 5 alleles per trait. This obviously isn't a very quantitative trait because there's only 5 loci. Okay? And let's say we start at this position here where we have one allele that has a positive effect, so these are variable loci, and there'll be one allele that has a positive and one allele that has a negative effect. So in the average across the whole population at first, we have on average 1 positive allele and 4 negative alleles, so 20% of the alleles are positive for this trait in the population, not a particular individual, and 2, on average 2 for the second trait and 1 for the third. And what we want to do is increase the frequency of these positives compared to the negatives. And if we do it well, we can be effective on that. We can increase here. We're going to 0.4, 0.53, 0.67 by these cycles of recurrent selection concentrating the favorable alleles. On the last day, on the last day, I think I'm going to talk a bit more about introgression and pre-breeding and how this relates to having a closed population. But you can see, if we have a population and we've increased the frequency of positive alleles, we've concentrated them really strongly in this population. If we bring in material from outside, the allele frequency is going to be maybe where we started out, maybe worse. But we're going to dilute this and make this less effective. So what we have to strike a balance of a completely closed population. That's the fastest way to increase the allele frequency. But there's resistance genes, for example, hanging around in other material that we want to bring into that population. We still need to bring those in, but we need to do it in a controlled way so as not to too negatively impact our ability to increase the allele frequency. So when we talk about a closed population, 90% is a rough guideline of how much we need to do, and then we need 10% to bring in different markers for other genes, different genes we know about, and so on. And there are strategies for doing that. I'll talk about that later in the week. Is everybody clear about the concept here? Because these are the basic concepts we'll take forward. Okay. So getting back to the question. Okay. All traits are valued. So if we're choosing a parent, now we're thinking about individuals, if we're choosing a parent, we want the parent that has the most positive alleles across all traits. That's what we care about. Which can also, in practice, means the parent, well, I'll show you in a second. So what's the best line for developing a product? Well, our product needs to meet a minimum threshold for all the breeding traits we're breeding for. It needs to have a minimum disease resistance, a minimum, it's going to go through a national testing program, probably some kind of yield enhancement over checks. It can have minimum quality traits. You've got to meet a threshold in your target product profile. So does everybody, I think most of you in CG have probably heard a lot about target product profiles. Is there anybody who wants a recap of that? I think I have it on the next slide. All right, I'll come back to that. So your target product profile is basically a list of, it's a mixture. It's got thresholds and it has targets for trait values. So this must be, to develop a best product, we must meet minimum thresholds. But the best parent for recycling maximizes the number of positive alleles across all target traits. So, if we have a line that is really fantastic at 3 traits, but doesn't make the threshold of the 4th, that probably is a good parent, but it can't be used as a product. And we'll talk about this later in the week, where we use a selection index to select the parents. This is just an example. A very small breeding program, you've only got 10 lines to choose from, 4 traits, and there's a threshold for the product here. So if we look at that closely, 3 lines can be products because they meet all the thresholds. And some of these lines, this is a pretty reasonable line. 8.2 here, it's pretty high on trait 1, meets the good on trait 2, pretty high on 4 as well. This might also make a good parent. But if you look at line 6 and 7, they make excellent parents. So this is highest for trait 1, highest for trait 2, pretty good on trait 4, way below the threshold on trait 3. This is covering lots and lots of positive alleles. That's going to increase your mean across those 3 traits in the next generation. And same for this. This is the highest one for trait 4. And it's actually the highest for trait 3 and 4, but it's not so great on trait 2. So these would make really good parents, but they're not going to be able to be used as products. So that's the other reason why we want to separate population improvement and product development. Any questions on that concept? Okay. So these are different decision processes. For population improvement, we're going to use a selection index to aim for our target product profile targets. Okay. And we almost certainly going to use genomic prediction. For the product development, we're going to use truncation selection with target product profile threshold, and we might use genomic data, but it's not as essential, or likely to be as essential as when we're improving the population. So to summarize, why separate population improvement? Recurrent selection is the most efficient approach. The faster we recycle the parents, the better, and the best product is not always the best parent. And why have I gone through all of this before getting to the Beda's equation and so on? It's because when we use the Beda's equation, we're thinking about population improvement, basically. So that before I start talking about the Beda's equation, we put it in this context. The Beda's equation is to optimize this, basically. It's a bit more complicated, but that's the basic way we need to be thinking when we're thinking of the Beda's equation. Okay. So in data-driven breeding, our aim is to optimize resource use to maximize genetic gain. We can use the Breeder's equation to guide the optimization process, and we'll use it focusing on population improvement. The Breeder's equation only gives you one generation of prediction, so we also are going to probably want to use some kind of simulations to help make more complex decisions of resource use. Third key point. Most breeders have in their brain an idea of where they want their breeding population to go. That's what breeding is. If we want to do it data-driven, we have to be explicit about what those are. We have to actually write that down, because we can optimize how you approach that only if we have explicit targets. And the targets in CG institutes come from your target product profile. Well, in commercial institutes as well, they're just used a different way. I think everybody's familiar with target product profiles. Here's just an example from Simit wheat. We have different traits. We have whether it's essential, nice to have, is it a threshold trait, or is it just so some things, might not be a threshold trait because we're going to try and push them a certain amount, but even if it's not a threshold, we have a target. So where's it gone? So yield potential, we're going to have a target to improve that on a rolling basis that, we might want to achieve 5% in 2 years, and that obviously each year, well, that means it's going to rise. So it's not a threshold, but something like, 1,000 kernel weight or test weight, they're going to be thresholds. There's a bit too many on here to use all in one breeding program, and we'll come back to that when we talk about selection indices. But But this is what you look at, and then you set your quantitative genetics to target the numbers that you have here. If you're in a commercial breeding program, your traits get assigned a value. So a yield increase of 0.1 tons per hectare is worth whatever dollars. And then you can make an index based on that. For CG, we have to look a bit more about how much you want to improve the relative value of each trait. But I'll come back to that in selections. Key point is we need targets to make this modern breeding work. Yeah, public breeding programs will trait-based target, commercial programs assign economic values. Okay. Fernando, should I go into the derivation or not?
No,
All fine as is? Okay. So in about 5 or 10 minutes, we're going to get a brief. Our Chief Scientific Officer for CIMMYT is going to give a brief introduction and welcome to everybody. So I'm going to just maybe go through one slide before that. You're all familiar with the Breeder's equation. Response to selection is the heritability times the selection differential. So the selection differential is the mean of the population that you started out with in the parent generation. And then the mean of the lines you selected when you did your truncation selection in this case. That difference is the selection differential. When you grow these lines, when you looked here, some of the variation underlying this curve is going to be from the environment, and some is going to be genetic. And the proportion of phenotypic variation, which is additive genetic variation, the variation we can select on, is the heritability. So this is S, but you will find when you get into the next generation, you will have moved the mean to the right, but you won't have moved it all the way over here because heritability is not 1, because only the proportion of this phenotypic variation which we could select on it has changed, but not the environmental component is lost. So we've moved the mean a little bit, and so R equals H squared S. R is the response to selection. The response to selection is, over time, is genetic gain, which we're trying to maximize. So we're trying to, this is the response in only one generation, we're trying to maximize this response over time. So, but the original, that's the original equation. And we can modify this to make it a bit more intuitive. So we're going to standardize it. It's like a standardized normal. We'll standardize the trait to have a mean of 0 and a variance of 1. Then we can use the standardized normal distribution. So we're taking away the, subtract from the mean, divide by the standard deviation of the distribution, and then we can say that we can then, so we've taken S, which is the selection differential, which is the difference in the means divided by the standard deviation, and we've standardized it to I. So I is the standardized mean of the selected group now. But you've got to multiply, as you can see here, we replace S with the phenotypic standard variation. So we're going to multiply by the phenotypic variation, the phenotypic standard deviation. Now I is the standardized mean of the selected group. It's on the same scale for every trait, every crop, and so on, and this is the intensity of selection. And if we want to know what the intensity of selection is for a given if we select 10%, we just can drop it in a really simple equation in R or Excel, and that will give you that's basically calculating what you're doing here.
when you're taking this truncation. So now we have R equals the intensity of selection times the heritability times the phenotypic standard deviation. But what we're more interested in is the additive genetic variance rather than the phenotypic variance. So as I think everybody knows, heritability can be considered one way of looking at heritability is the additive genetic variance divided by the phenotypic variance. It's the proportion of the variance that's genetic rather than phenotypic. If you rearrange this equation through a few bits, the maths is kind of minor, but you end up coming out that response to selection is the intensity of selection. Now it's the square root of the heritability times the genetic standard deviation. So we've switched from the phenotypic to the genetic, but in doing so, we have to square root the heritability. And that square root of the heritability is the accuracy now. And that, again, is a bit more intuitive. When we're thinking about accuracy, we can picture that a bit more easily, that that's what we are, we want to improve in our trials with them. And we can model that. So, we have the intensity of selection on a standard scale, we have the accuracy on a standard scale, and we have the genetic standard deviation. Genetic gain is the response to selection over time, so we divide by time. This can be years or breeding cycles, if you like. We usually talk about it in years, because when we're trying to optimize a breeding program for the resources we have resources in years, not breeding cycles. Okay. So, what it does, again, this is a catch-up for everybody. I'm sure most of you are familiar with this. The Breeder's equation predicts the change in mean genetic value, the genetic gain, of a quantitative trait within a population, given information about selection and the population in a single breeding cycle. And the aim of a modern breeding program is to maximize this change in the genetic gain. And we have 4 ways to do it, because we have 4 components. We increase the selection intensity. We select harder, test more lines. We increase the accuracy. More plots per line to increase replicates. And we could also improve our trial design or methodology. We can increase the genetic standard deviation, the variance. We can use some more diverse material, but as I've already said, that has some negative consequences. And we can decrease the cycle time, go faster. Without any genomic methods, we can do this by shuttle breeding, speed breeding, making crosses before we have data, and then culling the crosses. There's many ways to do that in practice. And I'm going to stop because Sarah's going to come in 2 minutes and give the introduction, and then we can go into this in more detail. But is there any, before then, is there any questions anybody has, anything that's not clear? I think most of this you're mostly familiar with. Okay. So I don't want to start the next topic until she gets here. So how many people in their breeding program have sat down and modeled the steps through the Breeder's equation?
Yeah. I didn't get the question.
So the question is, so how many of you have sat down with your breeding program and explicitly modeled it using the Breeder's equation to find the optimum number of parents, selection intensity? Taken the data you have and modeled it in the Breeder's equation. Yeah, a few of you.
Learning. Yeah, it is I set my breeding program down for the try to optimize or fix the try to have best optimized breeding scheme, parent selections, and started coursing. Now we are going to the first, I think that this season we will have the first cycle and start the recycling, and now going to the evaluations. It's at the early stage, but we have started applying this to optimize the selection of parents and also selection intensity. We'll apply that one and now, yes, recycle early. That is after the preliminary testing, stage 1 testing, recycle our parents. This is to optimize to get to improve the genetic.
Sorry,
what I did before. Yeah.
Do you want to add to that? Oh, okay. Yeah. So that was a technical question from Abby, and I'll just answer and then come back.
Yeah. Okay.
Is am I going to distribute the presentation? Yes, I will, but after I've done it, because if you come back and say, oh, what about this? Or if somebody finds a mistake, I want to send the final version. But I will distribute it after the lecture is finished. Juan, are you okay doing that? Or? Yes, okay.
Taking photographs.
So taking photographs is fine, but I'll give you the presentation. Saves them.
Sometimes people they are taking. I saw people are taking photograph of slides. So you will get that material. Don't worry.
Yeah, I'll give it a
Yeah.
Recently was published a paper in which they show that if you have the presentation, you don't put attention to the
So you don't, what, sorry?
I see.
If you have the presentation, you don't pay attention.
If you have the presentation, you keep the presentation.
Yeah, I prefer to give it afterwards when you've seen it, and then you can go back.
As I said that for the study step to optimize the question and improve genetic gain quickly, what we are applying for now is the rapid cycling. In the population OPV development, but for the line development for hybrid parents, we will apply RCA and genomic selection, of course, both to improve it. And also, we are working on the accuracy also, improve the data quality and other. Yeah. This is the step we put in place to optimize this equation.
Yeah, the accuracy is
Yeah, very important.
really important to make quantitative, I'll come to it in a bit, but to make modern, if you're going to do this in a data-driven way, the accuracy becomes incredibly important. Thanks. Anybody else want to share any experience? Yes.
Just in addition, under the PCP program, we've been trying to standardize, I think, most of the breeding programs across the NAS, and I think we have finally come up with breeding schemes that will follow around the minimum number of populations, we need to develop minimum number of lines, we need to advance to the next line, and I think it is all aimed at ensuring that we have more accuracy, we have more breeding efficiency in our programs, and at least when products are released and that to be shared in the region, at least to know that standardized processes where we have followed to ensure that this product is done. And I think this has really come as a helpful tool, especially to the NAS program, because in most of the cases, like you said, they're just there making crosses and without factoring in most of these things. And now with those breeding schemes, with the help of CIMIT and the DCP program, at least our breeding programs in the lands are being more like standardized, and you know all the operating procedures and what minimum number of populations you are to develop, especially if you are going to share most of these materials within the region. So I think we have found that to be very helpful in the lands, and that's what we see for making this happen.
Great.
In IIPA, we have been working with CIMIT like for years now, trying to standardize all the breeding operation, the target product profile, even standardize the scales for the traits. We have been using slightly different approach, but now we are trying to standardize all sorts of things. In the state gates, we are going to use same
Oh, exactly.
state gates now. Even I name breeding program C global name. So we have already completed that, and we are also collaborating with EDS and uploading for our data now. EDS. So we are pretty good.
Now, this is great to hear. Anybody else?
Coming from NARS, I think 2 years ago we wanted to put together the genetic game, and it wasn't, I mean, theoretically we know it, but practically it wasn't as easy as we thought we could really achieve it, because we don't have access to data. And it's all because as we're progressing in our breeding program, we aren't taking cognizance of all this data, putting it together. The processes are there, developing products is there, we use materials, but we don't have this data package that it will help us track our progress. So 2 years ago we started working with Adi and his team, Adi Sheikh, and hopefully by next year we are going to, together with Ravindra, the product develop the product manager for the PCP. I think moving forward our work is going to be more optimized. We are going to slightly have a clue on how to get to it.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, that to optimize this, you need to actually know some of these values in your population. And that's the discovery part of this, is that to get started, it takes 2 or 3 years to have that information if you're starting new. Juan, can you or Abhishek give Sarah a call to check? Sarah's going to come at 9:30, but she's not here. Anybody else want to talk about their breeding program and whether you've been using this? I'm pausing because I want to, it's like a next topic and I want to Sarah in first. Abhishek's going to find it.
Take you back to a previous slide.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Yes, a slide where you made a point, the best parent, the best product might not be the best parent. So yeah, next slide. Next slide. Yes, this one. Is it vice versa? Because I thought it should be the best parent, but not always be the best product. Just
it's both, I guess. Yeah. So,
because I believe the best product should be the best parent, especially in our self-pollinated crops like sorghum. Is it like that, or is this how it?
So, here, so the best product, you have to pass a threshold to get the best product. So only the red ones qualify as products. But this line here is the best for trait 1 and 2, and the second best for trait 4. That's a fantastic parent. It's carrying loads and loads of positive alleles for those 3 traits, but it fails to meet the threshold in trait 3.
Yeah.
So overall, this parent has got, across the 4 traits, probably has more positive alleles than one of these red ones, but it can't pass the threshold. So in that case, if you have a best product, and like in this case, these are probably decent parents, but they might not be the best parents. To me, this is a better parent because it's carrying if we go back here, let's just say, I've not set this up that way, but let's say, ignore the cycles and all of this, pretend these are parents, say. If we had a parent that had 5 red, 5 blue, and 2 green, that's 12. But you need 3 green to pass the threshold. So you could have a parent with 3 green, 3 red, 3 blue, passes all the thresholds, 9 positive alleles. If it has 5, 5, and 2, it's got 12 positive alleles, it's a better parent, but it fails, it can't be used as a product. So let's say that trait is disease. It has 40% yellow rust infection, or stem, let's say it's 40% stem rust infection, put that in Ethiopia, it's dead. It can't be used as a product there. But it might have fantastic yield, it might have really good quality, lots of other things, but it can't be used as a product. But it's still got more positive alleles than something that's kind of average across 4 traits. Basically it's saying if you're really good at 3 traits and below average on 1, you're probably a better parent than if you're average across all 4 traits. Because the parents are going to be used in fossing, so all the alleles are going to be mixed up. That's the thinking behind it. So yeah, they will overlap. I mean, some of the best parents are going to be the same as the best products, but to do the best you can, you need to take the parents that are good for some traits, but may not just pass on 4. Okay, and then I'll continue on.
The same previous one.
Which one?
Okay.
Sorry?
Okay.
Oh.
Yeah. If you take line 9, which is source for the 4 traits are messed up, that's okay. What will happen if trait is nice to have trait?
So if you pick 9,
Yeah, 9.
so 9 fails on trait 1 and 2 because it's not high enough. It's good here. So this one, it'll fail the threshold for.
If that trait is nice to have trait, what will happen?
Yeah, this is a very crude example. If that's a nice, so these traits will have different weights in reality. Yield is going to be more important than many traits often, and disease will be absolutely essential in some. So you have to, when you actually do this, you have to balance. They each get a weight depending on how important they are. And you set the weights using the target product profile. So yes, you're right. If trait 4 is really important, this actually might be a really valuable parent. That's a good point. Here she is. Okay, so this is so Alon is our Chief Scientific and Innovation Officer at CIMMIT, so in charge of all the science programs, and she's just going to give you a welcome to CIMMIT.
You're on a microphone, okay, I'm going to shout.
There's a microphone.
Oh, but can you all hear me?
Yes.
Am I loud enough? Is anybody online? 2, okay, then I will use this. Okay, good morning everybody, or potentially good afternoon to those who are online. Sorry I'm late, I was in another meeting trying to get out of it. So who has been to CIMMIT before here? 1, 2, come on, put your hands up. I've got old eyes, they can't see that far. Okay, so a few of you, so welcome to CIMMIT. I'm really looking forward to hearing your feedback when you get to the end of this course, and really understanding how you're going to use what you learn here, within your work in partnership with CIMMIT and some of the other organisations within the CG that you work in, and also your feedback about what things in here are you already doing and where you have other ideas for improvement. And so when we all work in breeding is like the classic elephant in the room. We all have our hands on a different part of the elephant. Hopefully we're all around the elephant and not in a different part of the zoo altogether. That's sometimes the case. But understanding, what the function of the leg is, what the function of the trunk is, it's really important that as a breeding community we come together and understand some of those challenges. And so I've worked with some fantastic quantitative geneticists in my career. It's been very rewarding. And sometimes their ideas are fantastic, and sometimes their ideas, we sketch it out on a piece of paper. I say, this is a lovely idea, but to do this I need 100 hectares of drought phenotyping, and I kind of haven't got that. And so being able to bring your expertise and experience into the conversation and really understand what is feasible from a breeding perspective, a logistics perspective, and how we really use the quantitative genetics theory to squeeze more juice out of the value of your breeding is going to be really important. And so I'm really keen on hearing from you where you are now, where you want to be in breeding, what your objectives and your vision is for your own breeding programs and your work, and how you're going to use the information that comes out of here to improve what you do, to make it more effective and to make it more efficient. And then I'd love to hear feedback on all my fabulous colleagues here. How good a teacher are they? How good are they at listening in addition to communicating knowledge to you? Okay, so my office is over in the building. Keith and others can point you out as to where I am. My door is mostly open when I'm not in meetings, which seems to be most of my life right now. But I'm really keen to hear your feedback, and hear how this course has helped you or how you think it will help you. And keen to hear your ideas and inputs to see how we can all work together to continue to modernise and improve breeding. So with that, apologies for being late. I'm very British, I don't like being late, so many apologies, and looking forward to interacting with you over the next days that you're here. Okay? Thank you. Back to you. Now this is going to fall off now.
It was balanced most of the morning. Thank you.
Nice balance. Thanks.
Any more questions about this? I think that's a really important point that we come to when we do selection indices, that these traits have different importance in the breeding program and in the target product profile. So we will be, in reality, multiplying this by a weight, depending on the importance. And that weight is set by the target product profile.
Yeah, my question is, when you was talking about the nice to have trait, I think that this need to be more focused on the essential traits than nice to have trait.
Yeah, that is a really important point, especially when you see how many traits there are. It does need to be focused on the essential traits. And are nice to have, so we can make these decisions on a yearly basis and we can drive towards targets, but each year you kind of see what progress you made and maybe you have to adjust the targets.
Okay.
And maybe if it's a nice to have and it starts drifting down, then it becomes maybe important to bring it back up. But essentially, the critical point is you can't do this for too many traits. You need to focus on the essential. That's a really good point. The one before this or the one? As far as I've got.
As you know, since especially genotypic program will follow the species process. Especially stage one, we follow from stage one to stage 5. Especially stage one, we test large number of phenotypes. So 10% selection depends. How can you make the stage? Because stage one is very large number, especially we are working with one, supported by this stage testing of selection. So 10% is, I think it is few because more than 1,000 lines we evaluate at stage one. If you 10%, I think taking more lives to stage 2.
So the 10%,
How can we manage that?
so you optimize it within the resources and the available land and so on you have. So my 10% that I showed earlier was really just an example. If you do 2 times 10%, it's better than trying to do it all in one go. But you will manage within your program what your constraints are. You have to work within that and try and optimize, whether it's 10%, 5%, 20%. I think it's really, so when I've used 10% twice, maybe that's part of the issue. So 10% selection intensity was just an example of that. It could be different. I don't know what, do you want to comment on?
In my experience, at the end, the decision is made on the capacity to elevate the process and contain the information more than quantity. Because we select around 60 parents in my stage 1, but at the end the process are made only 20 because they don't have capacity to do more growth. And of course we want to think that when you try to do the process, not always there is success. Sometimes the flowering don't match, or it's not thin, or you cut the cross but you don't have thin, all the things. You already know the number. Usually we select a little more than the target number, but the target number is most dependent on what is required.
So I think the broader point would be that, so when we're showing you the quantitative genetics, when I say it's data-driven breeding, it doesn't mean we're going to take the theoretical best approach. The approach has to be grounded completely in the capabilities at each stage, the resources available in terms of space, manpower, crossing ability. All of those go into this, and then within that framework, you do the best you can using the data-driven path. Sometimes you might, by doing the modeling, you'll find out that actually, within our program, we could make a really big gain if we changed this, if we invested in some logistics, more people to do crosses or whatever. Then it might give you that opportunity to look at it that way, but this is all going to be set in what the capabilities are. Abhishek. Do you want to?
Not just theory. When you increase the pressure of selection, you are increasing the phenotypic value.
Yeah, so point, actually the concern what has been around this now, like quantitative genesis, like we have been telling you, like don't select even too harder sometimes. Like may not go to 0.05% or 1% kind of selection intensity. Probably you may burn sometime your genetic variance so soon. And many such questions have been in discussion, like when we are, or what size we take. Like if we have like 2000 in stage 1 we are testing, and people say that select at least don't go minimum 5% or minimum 2%. Because sometimes that is also quite big number to take as a parent. So it's a matter of like discussion, and like everything may not go as with the principles. So there has to be a balance in that, like how many parents you tend to recycle. Probably maximum you cannot digest then. But if you have like only 20 parents or 10 parents, I don't know about your breeding pipeline, then how much you are taking to stage 1. So there has to be a balance in that. So I understand from where you are coming, like we have been telling like don't select too hard. But in some of our breeding pipeline where breeders just cannot take more than 40 parents to be recycled, then that comes down to very low number, like 2%. Is it okay? In some instances, like when you are using index selection properly, it's okay. It can be okay, but can be discussed. So,
Yeah, I'll come to the trade-offs part in the rest of the talk. This is the response to selection per cycle. So essentially based on the selection intensity. This is the log of the population size. It's almost linear with the log, so this thing is really, really got diminishing returns. If this wasn't on a log scale, this plateaus very quickly. And you can see that in the table down here. So, if you select 20%, the selection intensity is 1.4. I think I had the calculation here. So this is showing you how you the equation to get that selection intensity. If you select 10%, your selection intensity is 1.75. So just going from 20 to 10%, you spend twice as many resources. If you're going to get the same number of parents at the end, you have to go twice as many lines if you select 10% than if you select 20%. But the ratio is 1.25. So you're spending twice as many resources, but you don't get twice the gain. This gets more extreme the further down you go. If you select 1%, 2%, your selection intensity is 2.4, 1%, 2.665. You've only got 10% extra gain for 50% more use of resources. There's diminishing returns. Now, you may really think in some cases, and as we've already discussed, you're constrained by how many crosses you can make. So you might actually select quite intensely because of the constraint. But when you're thinking about selection intensity, we really need to think about the fact that the harder you select, the more it costs and the less the benefit. It's just it's a plateau. There's diminishing returns. This is the critical point. You can offset some of this by using genomic selection. It can make higher selection intensities more affordable. You don't grow every plant, you predict some of them, you're not spending as many resources. There are ways around this, but we need to remember this has got diminishing returns. And we can make a whole different set of schemes where we use 2-year cycles versus 1-year cycle, different intensities in different years. All of this can be just put into an Excel file and calculated quite easily. And I did some of that back here with I think actually the next slide. I put it back here. And this is the other point. There's a very strong trade-off of selection intensity and maintenance of genetic variance. So if you go really too hard, you might be reducing the variance in your population too much, too fast. So you want to, for your traits of interest, you want to select hard, but you don't want to reduce the variation just by probabilistically in the population too much. So that's a key trade-off here. There's a key trade-off and there's a diminishing returns issue. Does everybody understand and clear about this, what the challenge is here? Any questions? Okay. Sorry, somebody's trying to be admitted into the... Okay. Accuracy. So selection accuracy is the correlation of the measured and true value. So for phenotypic selection, it's the correlation of the phenotypic estimate and the true genetic value. So again, I think everybody's familiar, but the phenotypic variation is the genotypic plus genetic plus environmental variation. The environment here is everything in the environment in this simple equation. It can be the plot level variance, the trial level variance. It can be different environmental parameters. All of that goes into environmental. Everything that's not genetic is in the environment. Or everything that's not additive genetic. And I'm not going to explain additive genetic much now because it's going to be talked about in all the rest of the session. The key point here is that you want to reduce this term, so your VE, and this goes down as the number of replicants goes up. So VE is VR, the variational replicate, divided by the number of replicates. So this is the environmental variance for a single replicate, and this is the error variance of the variety mean, which is what you're trying to estimate, averaged over R replicates. So as you increase the number of replicates, this goes down, and your estimate is more accurate. This can happen at any level. It can be plants in a plot if you're working in certain, in many plots where you're looking at individual plants, can be plots in a trial, trials within a country years. This replication can be at any level, but all aspects of replication have the same phenomenon, which we can see here. So this is another example. We've genetic variance 0.1, environmental variance 1. This is low heritability and a very strong selection intensity example. So your response to selection and the number of replicas. Very quickly diminishing returns, even when you have essentially really low heritability, the value of adding more replicates drops off quite quickly. So this is a heritability that's about 0.1. And here you can see your accuracy here of 0.31, and then it goes up to 0.42 by adding a second replicate. So you've gained about a third of benefit, but you've grown 2 plots. Is that worth it? And then if you've grown 3 plots, you've gained another 1/7, so you've gained 14% more accuracy, but you've spent, again, 50% more than if you'd only grown 2 plots. As a general rule, depends on the trait, depends on what you're trying to do. In most trials, we really don't need more than 2 replicates because we could spend those resources by adding more replicates on changing other aspects of the breeder's equation much more efficiently. So you need a certain minimum number of replicates of some lines in a trial because you need to estimate the heritability, you need to estimate other quantitative genetic parameters potentially. You don't need that many, and the investment in increasing accuracy by replicates in a trial can be not that worthwhile. And if you're going, the difference between 9 and 10 replicates is trivial. But the key point, once again, diminishing returns. Okay. Genetic variance. So just a clarification here, which I'm sure most of you are aware of. This is the variance for the trait of interest, not genetic variation, not diversity, it's the variance. So, these 2 populations have the same mean, but this one has much higher. This has high genetic variance, this has low genetic variance. And the point here, if we make wide crosses to non-elite varieties, as we've already discussed, even just the cross itself, we don't focus on the population, it's going to have a negative effect on the mean. So here's an example. We have 2 comparison. And all of this can be just put into the breeder's equation. So we have an elite by elite cross. The elite parent has a mean of 100 for the trait. This is elite by elite, so it's 100 by 100. The variance in the inbred is 10. And here's elite by gene bank. The mean is 100, and then the gene bank one is half as high, but there's much more variance in this cross. Okay? So if you just make one cross, the best line you can get out using the breeder's equation with these numbers is going to be, on average, about 108. Okay? First shot at this, you're only going to just get 100.2. So that's, in one generation, much worse. But if you did a back cross, like we do when we incorporate gene bank material, we can get 100. We can get comparable to this. This is a selection with intensity of 2.52. But you've spent more time doing this. So you can incorporate this material, but now there's a trade-off with time when you're talking about maintaining and when you're incorporating genetic variance and you want high variance, you've got to trade off with time to fix it, or trade off with selection intensity. Okay. Cycle time. This is the time from being a parent to having a new parent in the recurrent selection scheme. And there's lots of ways to do this that aren't very technical. I mean, shuttle breeding, out-of-season nurseries. We can do it in a controlled environment like speed breeding. And as I said before, we make the crosses before we have the data so that we can then cull the crosses. So if in your system crosses are cheap, maybe we can do that. The most important thing about cycle time is, yes, there are trade-offs, but there's no diminishing return. If you go twice as fast, you get double the response. There's a limit, there's only so short you can make your breeding program. There's only so short you can make it and have good data for decision making, like I said earlier, but basically, if you go as fast as you can within the constraints of having good data to make the decision, that's the best way to go. I brought that up at the start, and that's because there's no diminishing return on time. But there's going to be trade-offs. The main trade-off, you have fewer opportunities to measure the trait, you've got lower accuracy. And this is the main way in which genomic prediction can help your breeding program, by overcoming this constraint of low accuracy of estimates at an early stage of the program. So genomic prediction comes in potentially at many stages, but this is the key. If you're looking at the bigger overall picture, this is the stage where genomic prediction helps you. It overcomes the lack of early, good quality data, and therefore you can enable you to go faster. Okay. A summary of that, so diminishing returns on intensity, diminishing returns on accuracy, some really big trade-offs with increasing the variance. Obviously, it reduces mean for the traits, and you have to, and trades off with these as well. Decreasing the cycle time is linear gains, which is great, but you've got to trade off with accuracy. Any others? Anybody got any questions of where we are at the moment? Okay. So then the question comes, we know we want to go fast. How do we increase the accuracy of estimation of genetic value? And the answer is, this is where we're getting into how we use genomics, and this is so. I'm going to go through a brief overview of the two ways we can think. There's two ways to think about using genomic data in breeding. And these two ways were developed separately at first by animal breeders and plant breeders, but basically, at the end, they concluded the outcome, if you run a similar model with different approaches, you get the same answer. So, but I find that the two ways of thinking about this, some people really get one way, and some people really get the other way, and it's good to talk about both different ways of thinking about using genomic data. I find the relationship part easier, but other people might find the second approach. So relationship-wise, if you've never met me, but you want to know about me, what sorts of extra information could you find out about my genetic characteristics? Family, exactly. So my relatives, my full sibs and my parents are going to share half my genes. So there's information on my relatives about me. Some things will, they are correlated with me. So if you have a field trial, relatives, like full sibs, are going to provide information, extra information on the performance of a focal individual. So we can use that information. It's sitting there waiting to be used. If we know the relationship between the other individuals and between the individuals in that trial. Now we can get that information from pedigrees, but I'm going to come back to this. It's something I want to emphasize in this initial talk. Pedigrees are error prone. So let's say you recycle at the F6 in your population. You made a cross. Your plants, let's say we're doing it in a line crop that's self-in. You made a cross, but some of those might be self. You made a cross, but you've got to pick up the pollen from a plant that's labeled here, move the pollen to another plant. There's human error there. You planted, and you made the cross, you plant the F1. you have to get the label right on the packet. You have to put the packets in the right order in the field. You have to take the right data when you're going around the field. You have to harvest them. You have to put them back in a packet. At each step, there are 4 ways errors can happen. There are 6 steps. That's 24 places where human or mechanical error can happen. Often with moving labels around. Even if you do this with barcodes in the best commercial companies, there's 5 to 10% error is a fantastic result. If you're getting 5 or 10% error in your germplasm, in keeping up with your germplasm over 6 generations with 4 or 5 steps in each, that's at a good level for human error. And there are studies on human error. What is like the average error rate in particular tasks? And I've read them and I've tried myself. And we had a data set where we had to do some QC by hand, where we're moving data from an Excel file, from a written into Excel, and you can see how many mistakes you make. And I worked out the average. It's kind of annoying. A friend of mine, a colleague of mine, we both took a data set each. He did it while watching television with his kids and got a lower error rate than me. But there is an error rate that humans make, and put it over like 30 different steps, there will be errors. So to me, 20-30% wrong pedigrees is not uncommon, especially if you don't do F1 genotype QC. You're going to have that kind of error rate in your germplasm. So maybe that's okay, but genotyping error, you've got fewer steps where you can go wrong. And we have good ways of checking genotyping error. So we can we can calculate a genomic relationship matrix. We run some genotyping on our individuals. You need a few hundred markers, and you'll get a pretty good accurate estimate of how related everybody is in your breeding population, everything that's been grown. And we can use that to predict the genetic merit of individuals, and this is the basis of GBlock. Is borrowing that information from relatives to predict genetic merit of individuals. I don't like doing it with pedigree, but that's an option if you don't have a data. But really, we're just going to, this is it, and this is also the real relationship. So you have a bit of extra benefit here. If you have the pedigree, it tells you you're 0.5 with your full sieve. But in reality, nobody's 0.5. They're somewhere on a break. 0.5 is the mean. You could be 0.47, you could be 0.5 each. The genomic relationship matrix tells you the exact number, or not the exact. A much more precise estimate of how related you are to a full sieve. And that's important because you want to know those subtle differences can be important. It's more accurate in 2 ways. The other way to look at this is by marker. So if you have 2,000 markers that represent your genome, you look across the field. I think this is the next slide, okay? This is 2 examples of markers. So here's your field, here's 1 rep, 2 rep. The individuals in yellow have allele 1, green allele 2. This is another marker, and you'll have 1,000 or 2,000 markers. Allele 2 is blue, allele 1 is red. And if you think about it, you can say, well, what's the average yield, say, of an individual with allele 1, allele 2? And then there's going to be a difference. Now, if you're interested in whether that difference is significant, you're doing G-wise. But what we're doing in genomic prediction is saying we're going to assign, across every marker we'll say, we'll see if we'll have an idea of how that allele, a straightforward idea of how that allele affects the trait, and we just sum up all those individual effects. And because, in this, I can't remember how many, I think this is 80 or 80 lines here, maybe. No, 96 lines. Most alleles will be, not at a super low frequency in the population here. So we can make a reasonable estimate from the field trial of how much any particular allele affects the trait at a particular marker. Sum them up, and that is That's the basis of ridge regression plots. So there's some statistical complications in that. I'm not going to go into them because that will be discussed later in more detail. I mean, the key point about the statistical limitations is a lot of these methods existed a long time ago in the literature, but couldn't be used because we didn't have the computational power. Now we do. And so it was relatively straightforward when the ideas were there to move forward and develop these methods of genetic prediction. So this is, it's basically the relationship matrix versus looking at it from the allele point of view are different angles, and some people find it easier to understand one than the other. But when this was in the early days of genomic prediction work, it was basically found that when you did these two approaches and you made most other things, all the things being equal, you get the same answer. So how many people here would think about this in terms of relatedness versus the value of a marker allele? So how many people kind of find it easier to understand this as relatedness? One?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you really use also the half city to estimate genetic bar or only the full six?
You use the pattern of all the relationships. So you're saying that individual 1 and individual 2, they could be related 0.5, 0.25, 0.37. You're using all of that information combined. So it doesn't matter what you use, you're going to adjust for it. But if you only have weak relationships, it doesn't work as well. That's the key point. Did you? So how many people prefer to think about this as of giving a value to every allele? Is that an easier way to think about this? How many people think like? Does everybody understand that concept first of all? Or should I go back over it and do it? Yeah, that's all right. Okay. I thought I didn't explain it very well. So, imagine this is your field, and these are two reps. And individuals, either a particular marker, have allele 1, which is yellow, or allele 2, which is green. And all of these individuals have a phenotype, let's say yield for now. So, if you look across this data set without doing any statistics at first, you can say that on average, individuals with allele 1 have a yield of 5.1 tons per hectare. Individuals with allele 2 have 5.3 tons per hectare. So we might say, well, okay, allele 2 gives you a plus 0.2 tons per hectare benefit. And then you can look at the other 2,000 marker alleles and calculate exactly the same for all of them. Allele 1 at the second marker might give you a plus 0.1 on you. And you do that for markers, and then you just simply, then you can look, so you've got a good estimate because you've got a lot of individuals with each marker in the file. So for each one, you've got something of an estimate. If you wanted to prove that an allele was significant, but significantly affecting the trait, you would run a significance test, and you've done it, that's association marking, that's GWAS. It's on the same principle. But what we're doing with genomic prediction here is we're saying, we're going to, there's an accuracy to this, but we're going to assume every marker has an effect. Even if that effect is really tiny, we'll just give an effect value to each marker. So then, we've done that across the whole population, so then we go back to one individual, okay? So we go back to, let's say, this individual, and we say, okay, what allele does he have at every marker? And if he has allele 1 at marker 1, that means he's got plus 0.2. And if it's got allele 2 at marker 2, that's minus 0.1. And we just add those up. And we will get a prediction. It's a bit more complicated than that. We'll go into the maths next week. But basically, you've then got a prediction for this individual for the yield based on what markers it contains, rather than that can complement, in a way, the actual information that you got from the trial. So it's extra information. So when we're looking at relationships, we're saying this one is a half sieve of this one, So that, whatever the yield was here actually provides extra information on this individual. This might have actually had a yield of 5.5 in the trial, but all of its half SIPs had 5.7. So maybe that 5.5 is actually just, maybe we might bring that over here because we've got information from that. What we're saying with the markers is it had a value of 5.5, but if you look across all the field at every marker and each marker effect, and you add up the alleles this has, then actually it might be 5.4 and 5.6. But it might, again, you've got an extra bit of information, because the only information on that individual is the 2 reps in this trial. You'll see where this goes in a minute, because at the moment it might seem a bit obscure because we're running a trial and we're getting information. But actually we get more information if we look at all the other individuals in the trial, either because they're related, or in this case because they share a set of alleles that we can evaluate across the whole trial.
Is it wise to decide using few markers which have major effects than many markers which have minor effects?
Yes, so that's an approach. You can take that approach to say, well, only take the markers that look like they have a large effect. And some genomic prediction approaches, that is one alternative. And again, I'm not going to talk about the names of the methods till we talk about that in a week, but that is an approach you can take. There are methods that focus only on the ones that are most important, and there are ones that focus on mixing, giving a certain extra value to the ones that are more important compared to the rest of them. And there are methods like RR-BLUT, which just takes all of them. So those are all different options you can take when you're doing genomic prediction. The one that equates to using relatives is RR-BLUT, which takes everything. But that kind of makes sense because the variant relationship is also based on everything. But you can do, that's certainly an option that is available. Is there another question?
So, can I ask a simple question? How do we put in a combined activity in this picture? I know we are talking of markers, but at the end of the day, we would like to see how is the real performance in the field just from the phenotypic perspective. So, when I look at individuals, I'm talking of specific combined activity, am I right? And the general picture is the GCA. So, how do we factor this as breeders if we have to make decisions?
So, the GCA is just a different trait. So you're essentially doing, it's the same principle, but so this is just kind of like a toy example, but it's the same principle. You just change what the trait is, which is general combining ability, and you can do the same analysis. I'm explaining here the underlying principles, but the same applies. You would just, it's essentially a slightly different.
This isn't substituting the same concept of GCA and SCA, but complementing it, or if I have this, I no longer need information from GCA and SCA.
No, you still need the information from there. The trait is still GCA or SCA. But the principles can apply to both. It's a bit more the maths is slightly more complicated, but it's essentially the same underlying principles will work. You just have to think about the trait. I'll explain a bit, you might become a bit clearer in the next slides what I'm talking about there.
Yeah, I just want to say we have been using this one you know this in one. But when it comes to GCA, SCA, we have to evaluate them again to see the GCA and the SCA completely apart from this one. We select this one in the book and we cover it at least. And those materials for the breakdown is covered and it's complete book and details it for the combined.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. It adds complexity to the system, but the underlying principles still apply to most qualitative. But I understand that's a slightly different. You have to think about it in a bit more of a complicated way to make that work. So these two things are just slightly different ways of seeing the same phenomenon. And I personally find the relationship one a bit easier to understand, but I think they both, some people just prefer one. So that's how you can use genomic data and what it does for you. Genomic prediction is a technology in the sense that it's, can you have affordable numbers of markers? But really, it's complete, it's just, to understand it, it's understanding how a breeding program works. It's not anything really beyond that. So how is it used? And again, if some of what I just said was unclear, this is going to be repeated in the week. So when you're learning any subject, but particularly quantitative genetics, hearing people explain it from different angles, you build a picture and create your understanding. So if some of this isn't clear, I will go over it again, but it's also going to be covered. So, if we're just doing the field trial alone, we can improve the prediction of the genetic merit of individuals using relatives within an experiment. And this is how powerful it can be. So this is simulation. We have 3 different heritabilities here. So these are specific field trials. So we have low heritability, 0.2, medium, 0.5, high, 0.3. Accuracy, and I'll talk about accuracy in a second. We have 5 different structures of families. So here we have a small number of families with loads of individuals, which in theory, that's not right, yeah, families. And here we have many families with few individuals. So the blue is how many reps you would do in a field, just a regular field trial. So this is 1 rep in this particular field scenario with low heritability, and you can get an accuracy of about 0.4. If you have 2 reps, like we were saying earlier, there's diminishing returns. You don't go from 0.45 to 0.9, you go to 0.45 to 0.58. And this is in the low heritability situation. In the high heritability situation, you're starting out at very high, and the accuracy gains. But what happens when you use, so this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 reps in the trial, and this is 1 and 2 reps plus using the genomic relationship method. So if you use 1 rep, if you want to use, in this worst case scenario of low heritability and few families, if you have 1 rep, 0.45 accuracy, you want to spend, you double your money, you plant a second rep in the field, you get a 0.58. Instead of planting out the rep, you genotype it. Let's assume genotyping costs for now the same as another plot. Well, now you're getting up to 1.1. It doesn't add as much when you're in high heritability, you're not necessarily benefiting as much. But if your heritability is low and you're in a challenging situation, adding the relationship matrix improves your accuracy. That's just within a simple 2 rep. Simple 1, 2, 3, whatever rep field. So even if you have genomic relationship matrix, again, this assumes the GRN is 100% accurate. You may have some genotyping error that pulls that down a bit. But, you can make a lot of, that's a key benefit. So that's a simple scenario. Now we have a more complex scenario. Like I said earlier, if you want to know more about me, you find out, you go find my family and get that trace. So now, what we can also do is we can predict the value of a line without measuring it for that trace. So we can use the data from relatives grown under the relevant condition. So this is it's not going to be as accurate as if you have the data on that particular individual, but it's going to give you information about an individual you've never seen, especially if you have a lot of relatives. In practical terms, this means we can do sparse phenotyping. And one is going to go over the details of this later in the week, but I think a lot of you, particularly from the DCP program, have heard a lot about sparse phenotyping. This is an example from stage 1 Summit Week that we're thinking of implementing. What does sparse phenotyping do for you? Well, here's a toy example, 4 environments, 50 lines being grown. One thing we could do is we could save some money. So let's take away 20% of the plot, save ourselves $30,000, and we're predicting these individuals instead, and we still might have a reasonable accuracy, but we'll save a bunch of money. You could say instead of saving money, let's spend the same amount of money and grow more individuals. So we'll increase the selection intensity. So now instead of saving 20% plots, we grow 20% more individuals. So this was an example actually in the week program. We're going from 2,268 to 2,722 lines. Our selection intensity goes from 1.36 to 1.46. We've got a 7.5% increase in intensity and all other things being equal to the thing. So we can spend the same amount of money and increase our selection. Or we could say we want to test in more environments. So let's go from 4 to 6 environments. So there's a lot of there's various applications of sparse phenotyping. A lot of the time we're forced into doing it because we want to grow really fast. We want to test it, we want to recycle at stage 1. We don't have enough seed. So we only have one, so we do it anyway because we're forced to. But in terms of, we can put the economic value of doing that into the reader's equation. So this is another way of looking at, we're using genomic data here in the first 2 examples. We are using the genomic information horizontally. So we're saying within this generation, we can get better predictions, we can save some money, we can increase selection intensity by using genomic data because we know that relatives share information. Benefit, when the biggest benefit, which we said earlier with regard to cycle time, comes when we start doing this vertically, so through time. So we use the information from historical data, so last year's yield trial. We assume that we're running a breeding program fast. Last year's yield trial, the individuals in that are related to what we currently have in our stage 1. They're not as closely related as if it's like a full population, but they're still related. So now instead of, we are predicting individuals that we're growing now using the data from pastures, from relatives in pastures. And if we do that, if it's a trait that's highly heritable, so the accuracies of prediction are pretty high, we don't need to measure all the traits before we start the evidence. So, a lot of people, quality traits, for example, and many quality traits, they're high heritability. And they're really expensive to measure, and they're only usually measured late in the breeding program because they're so expensive. And that slows us from going down fast, so we predict them. We don't need to, we have 5 years previous data, we predict using genomic prediction, we get 0.8 accuracy, we're good. Importantly, so if we go back to the start with when traditional breeding, you want to get a lot of data on the trait that's harder to measure, like yield or lower heritability. So it would be nice to have more than 1 year's data. I mean, we probably do need to always make sure we have yield data in most crops. We're going to really want to measure yield at least once to have that information in there. Traditionally, we might have measured stage 2, 3, and then we've got a really accurate measure, then we make a decision. So now we use the historical data to add to that. Using the genomic connection, basically related to earlier individuals. So we can actually measure traits fewer times than if we only use the phenotype data. Because we got this historical data instead of waiting to get more data in the future, we use historical data to add. We also have the benefit if we have 5 years of historical data and our weather conditions vary between years, we've incorporated some environmental information. It's actually really important in our selection decision. And so this is probably what is mostly called genomic selection. The selection of individuals based on a genomic breeding value, incorporating the information across several traits using the genotypic connection. And this is the big win. You've reduced the cycle time. And that's, all of these things are important, and if we're going to do this, well, of course, we've got the data, the genomic data to do this, the other two as well. So we're going to gain these benefits, but the really big win is reducing the cycle time by making sure that we have enough information to make our crucial decision when we make the parental recycling, by bringing the information from relatives that have been grown at other times historically. Is that fairly clear? Okay. So when genomic selection was, so genotyping is not free. And the accuracy is not 100%. So there's some trade-offs here. Essentially what we're doing is minimizing the loss of accuracy compared to if you actually collected data over a longer period of time. And there's a reason why genomic selection was widely adopted in animal breeding. It's because the benefits are really clear. If you've got if you want to know the genetic value of a bull for milk production, you've got to get the bull to maturity. The bull's got to make some cows. The cows have got to get to maturity. You've got to measure the cows. That's a huge investment of resources compared to some genotyping. It's pretty, you don't need to think very hard with the genotyping. Even in the early days when genotyping was more expensive, it's kind of obvious you're going to save loads of money doing that. It's not quite, it's a bit more subtle in crop species because we don't have some of those constraints. And so the margins of whether it's worth it or not are a bit more, we have to work around the margins rather than say, well, obviously this is the best thing to do. We have to think, if we implement genomic selection, a genomic selection strategy with these other parameters in the breeder's equation, and we look at how that works, is it worth doing? And usually, it is worth doing if we're doing, for predicting future individuals to reduce the cycle time. Probably, if you only did this, you're looking at marginal gains. I think that's probably a little note on prediction accuracy, because we have, with the breeders I work with, sometimes there's the idea that if we show genomic prediction accuracy of 0.4, well then we can't use genomic prediction. But that's because what the accuracy, what we're comparing to is how well you were doing phenotypic prediction. So if your trait's really not very heritable, not very highly heritable, you're not going to do very well with your phenotypic prediction either. So we've got our accuracy, the square root of the heritability. So let's say our heritability is 0.5, our accuracy is 0.7. We're not trying to get a prediction accuracy of 0.9 from the genomic data. We're comparing to 0.7, not to 1. So that's like a critical part to me of when discussing with breeding colleagues is how well do you do compared to phenotypic data, not how well do you do compared to getting 1, because nobody's going to get a prediction of 1.
Can you come again with that?
Yes, so prediction accuracies are like the core of genomic selection. You want to get your prediction accuracy higher. Because if you can get your prediction, let's say, in theory, if my prediction accuracy is 0.5, then you might say, well, I need to halve my cycle time to make that worthwhile because our only prediction is 0.5. But you're not comparing to 1 with your prediction accuracy. What you're comparing to is how well you would do with genomic prediction versus how much well you would do with phenotypic evaluation. So if your heritability is 0.5, you don't predict, and you're saying, I'm going to grow another yield trial, you're not going to be able to predict the phenotype in that other yield trial that accurately. Your accuracy is going to be 0.7 because the heritability is low. So you're not trying to set, and your genomic prediction is on the same scale as that. So if your phenotypic ability to predict the performance of your individual in a future yield trial is 0.7, then you compare your genomic prediction accuracy to that. So if your genomic prediction accuracy is 0.6, and you could save 2 years, then you're going to do genomic prediction. Because your heritability tells you how accurately you can actually evaluate your phenotypic data. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Are there any values that you can consider an acceptable level of predictability, or to say that this predictability level is not acceptable, this accuracy or prediction, even in terms of accuracy? A value that we can say, oh, this accuracy level is not good enough.
The absolute value for heritability. So heritability, when you estimate heritability, you can, in the model, you can say, is there a significant phenotypic effect? So let's say your heritability is around 0.1 or something, and it might be a difficult trait, but it might be that you can actually put some kind of significance test on that and say, is there a significant phenotypic effect? And at the absolute, if there isn't, then there's not much value in the data. Otherwise, it's trait dependent. Some traits are low heritability. And the key metric is whether you can do better with genomic prediction or as well or better, comparing the genomic to the phenotypic. But there's no absolute, I wouldn't put an absolute value, well, I would actually, when I'm answering trials, I'll put like 0.15, but 1.15, yeah. But it really depends on the trait and how difficult it is to measure.
For instance, for you, in your program, is there a level of, predictability value that you say, I'm not going to take this?
I usually take, in our program, I usually take something about 0.15, because that's roughly where it becomes not significant. But that's, I don't know, Juan, what do you?
I hate to say values. Because each program, even each year, is a different thing. For example, the last year in Zimbabwe, as a very drought environment, and then that is the other option. We start over and tell you, we lost all the year, or we analyze the data with the 1.
The possibility, the heritability is low, still possible doing that.
Depending on the trials, is that depending on the year, depending on the population, depending on the environment, and many other things. For me, the two most important things are: one, you know your environment, your population, and you are not analyzing one year data. You know what happened the last 10, 15 years or so on. Then, if you historically have phase 0.3, 0.1, maybe it's not so good, but very by time you have 0.1. And the other thing is that you know what happened in the space. Then you have an additional reason, biological reason or economical reason, to remove one experiment or all experiment. So you know what to health, animals, logic, other health disease. It's not only statistical determinant. As Patrick used to say, you know, I really have it. So the analysis
Very context. I mean, another way of looking at the context is, so it depends a bit what you've got. So if you're modeling a multi-environment situation, multi-environment file situation, if we're using blobs, which we'll come to later, if you don't have much information, they're all going to be shrunken. So you've accounted for the issues in your field file and analysis. But if you're running, if you have 6 locations, and 5 of them are really strong, and 1 is pretty poor, that's not going to add much information, and you lose some degrees of freedom by including it. So maybe statistically it's better to drop it. or maybe it's not. But if they're all 0.1 heritability, then there's no real.
1 or 2 weeks ago, I analyzed the data set, developmental field analysis, and we have one location with 0 heritability. Zero. No, 0.01, 0. Then we run the combined analysis, and we recalculate the genetic variance and the residual error in each environment using regime matrix, using a model that modeling the environment by genotype interaction. The heritability of that site now is 0.35. Then the GRM also affected that because one side could be very poor, but using all the other information of the other and the other side, maybe make a better prediction of that one. Of course, I don't know the size out.
I will take that location out.
Yeah, the first one.
Yes.
Take out.
Yes.
Of course, I will not. I don't use to decide to take off data from the data. Yes, the leaders, because they know the location. They know. Okay, it's 0, but why? It's just because the environment, bad condition.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, if you use the relationship matrix, you're bringing in more information and you can maybe change what you see. It's all about the GRM is all about bringing in extra information that you to connect data sets. Everybody clear on the accuracy idea? Because I think this is critical, absolutely critical for interpreting genomic prediction accuracy. Is that we're comparing to how well you would do in a phenotypic evaluation, not how well you do absolutely. Have you?
I think regarding the point on heritability, so a lot has been said, how things will go in multi-environment trial, like how we see, and in some cases there is one setting on 0, couple of times that's because of the algorithm also what we use to calculate genetic variance that happens. Like in the for the variance box program and for others, and it also now you see here on the at what stage of trial also sometimes interpretation of heritability matters where you are. We just cannot say a blind number. But for a couple of things like advanced stage yield trials or when we are, that heritability has to be seen with very many other parameters. I think we have been talking in our meetings, like there are very many other parameters of trials also what we may need to consider, like quality of design, sometimes coefficient of variation, and then of course the trait. So, and few point, and we all we all are researchers here, like we may have our own different idea, but at few considering some of those statistics, we may choose to decide not to probably include a locations data, and some cutoff has to be defined. That's not a very straightforward answer. It's a bit tricky, but it plays a major role. Like probably as one said in few trials, he saw just 0.1, but he could use some other methods, to increase, or it was 0, like negative variance component probably he might have got, and to take it to 0.35. So what if after doing lots of other things we are not able to reach, then we may, based on our preference and what stage you are, probably decision has to be taken. I strongly sometimes drop few locations from my analysis.
Yeah, I think we all get the same questions from readers. It's like, when do you drop? Why do you decide to do this cutoff? And sometimes the answers are complicated. So I've been getting at this all along, is that going back to the Breeder's equation, it's all about trade-offs. So selection intensity, accuracy, variance, cycle length. They're incredibly non-independent, so if you increase replication, you're probably going to reduce intensity because you can't afford to test so many lines. If you reduce time, we can't test over so many years, so your heritability goes down. But we can look at ways, look at how you can compensate and work through the Breeder's equation for this. So, for example, in this case, if we our accuracy is 0.75 in this particular situation, and our intensity and our variance are the same. Well, over 4 years, we get a 0.38 genetic gain here, but if our accuracy, wait, is that the accuracy? I think I've got something wrong in there. Anyway, the point is you can put it in the Breeder's equation and compensate it. But there's a key thing we're missing in all of this, is that we could use the Breeder's equation to make predictions. Very just straightforward to put the numbers in. But what we're missing is this. So we don't want, if you just say we want the fastest genetic gain, well, we've got infinite resources, that's pretty straightforward. But we have to, what we're really interested in is the genetic gain per unit time within the available resources. You can frame it if you want to ask, if you're asking for more resources, which we all like to do, you can maximize the genetic gain per dollar, another way of looking at it, but usually we want to constrain by resources. So we want to increase the intensity, we reduce the accuracy because we keep the number of plots the same. If we want to add genomic prediction, well, as you saw, it can really help. If you want to do genotyping, that can help you with your accuracy, so maybe then you can grow fewer plots instead of doing 2 reps, you do a p-rep with only a small number of lines replicated, and you're using the genomic. And you're evaluating, so genetic gain is a KPI for the breeding process, essentially. I think at least everybody who works in CG institutes is dealing with KPIs, so key performance indicators. And actually this scheme is set in a broader context, so this is a EIB type diagram, so you've got population improvement, that what we're talking about, processing, evaluation, and selection. This is where you're using the Breeder's equation, but then we advance lines, we still have to develop the products, we have to multiply. This might be done by partners, release products, adapt varieties, establish product profiles, maybe introgress some germplasm, we need an introgression pipeline, back to the core. So all of this needs to be taken account of in the calculation. And I'm just, as a caveat here, in these they use delta G instead of delta R for genetic gain. They're equivalent here. Sometimes people use different terminology, which is a bit unfortunate, but that's the way it is. So, not all of the factors are as easy or inexpensive to manipulate. If you apply them over multiple cycles, they interact in complex ways, and the Breeder's equation is only telling you what happens in one cycle. So in general, if you want to look at it over the long term, it's useful to have some simulation. And I think quite a few of the DCP programs have done this. Is that right, Abby? Simulations of the breeding program to see what the best, given your quantitative genetic parameters that you have, what might be the best approach. Okay. I put this example in, I don't know if, Juan, are you going to cover the sparse phenotyping? So, okay, I'm not going to go into any details. This is just the simplest, this is a very simple version of simulation, or that Angela did, who's sitting here, for how to do sparse phenotyping in maze examples with different testers and different groups. The details Juan is going to go into. What I want to show you is just the thinking behind it. These are all different experiments, 1 to 6 are different scenarios. What we have here is the accuracy, essentially the correlation, the rank correlations for different scenarios. So this is how well you're doing. This is how well you're doing if you're doing sparse, getting the overall estimate across all trials. And this is if you're using the four other, using all the trial information to give predictions within a site. So if you went back here, there's a low correlation between Kiboko and other sites, so probably if you try to predict in Kiboko using all the data, you'll do worse than other sites which you do. The key point is here, this percentage is how many resources you save. And this is the context we need to do this simulation. So this says if you save, in this particular case, if you save 40% resources, you get an accuracy of 0.8, pretty good. But even if you save 93%, so you're only spending 7% of the total money, you can get an accuracy of 0.7. Do you want to do that? Depends on the other parameters, depends on your resources. But you're framing it in money saved. And that's the way we need to frame the simulation. And I think Juan is going to talk a lot more detail about these things later, but I'm just providing the overview on that here. So the Breeders' equation makes these assumptions that what you select and evaluate and combine are the same, selections done in one stage, non-overlapping generations, etc. We don't know if they all hold, and we can't follow for more than one generation. So we use simulations, and I'm going to just... Alpha SimR is what people have used a lot here, and it's a good package, and if you go to that EIB website I gave you at the start, you can actually have the code for some of these simulations to run yourself. But also your QG lead for your program can do this as well. And these are stochastic simulations. So you're making some assumptions of, what kind of trait do you have? Is it a fully quantitative trait, or is it a bit less complicated? There's maybe 4 or 5 genes. What the ploidy, the variants you have in your which you take this information from what that you already have from the trials. How much G by E, you take that information from what you already have. Genetic correlations between traits, you take that from what you already have. And you can create a breeding population with some of these traits, and then you can start running it through generations and try different scenarios. Do I run 20 parents? Do I run 40 parents? Do I run 100 individuals per progeny per cross, or 200 per cross? How intensely do I select? When do I select? All of those things can be put in the simulation. You have to constrain the parameters because doing all combinations at once isn't going to work. But you can get a feel from this as to, in your population, what might be the optimum scenario. You can home in on a scenario, and you can also cost it. You can say, well, this is what would happen if we didn't use genotyping. If we use genotyping to do genomic selection, at other stages in sparse phenotyping, this is the benefit we would get. We have to make a cost saving elsewhere. Is that worth doing? This is a very broad example that was one of the earlier papers using this. So this was a simulation on whether it's better to separate population improvement from product development. The papers here. So here we have a breeding program, conventional breeding program. In cross, we do down the head rows of the 3rd year, preliminary, advanced, yield trial, and so on. Variety in 8 years. How many crosses you make, and then there's some options as to incorporate genetic selection. You could do genetic selection on the head rows, the preliminary yield trials, or later on. And then we have a thing here where we separate population improvement from product development. And again, a couple of different options for where we bring in the genomic selection. And so looking at the left graph for now, conv is conventional with genomic selection, this is a late stage, preliminary yield trial head row, and then separating completely product development and population improvement. And you can see that over time, you've got a bit of time where nothing happens, but then over time you get increased genetic gain by separating, and from the story within, if you incorporate genomic selection in a standard breeding program, earlier you do it gain. And the same pattern holds when you increase, you add in some genotype idea. Just an early example of this, there's lots of examples out there, and CG programs have done this. There's some examples online as well. You can see where CG programs do these kind of simulations. I'm not going to give loads of examples of this. I'm just bringing up a few points that come out of the general simulations that have been done. So overall, you want to select, there's a trade-off between accelerated gain and loss of diversity. You don't want to select maybe too hard. There's a short and long-term gain. There's several methods we'll come to later in the week, but balancing those out. In general, in an active breeding program, it's quite hard to really run the diversity down extremely. I mean, obviously, if you only have 2 parents, you're going to, but often diversity is maintained quite effectively for. Is your breeding program on a scale of 50 years, 100 years, 200 years? To my mind, if you're looking at more than 50 or 100 years, you're in scenarios that aren't very realistic, because things are going to change over that time. You could introduce diversity from elsewhere if you lose it. If you look at the 50 to 100 years, that's more than enough, and you'll find that maybe you don't lose that much diversity over that time unless you have a really extreme selection intensity. Yeah, so the optimal number of parents, which is intensity, is a function of cycle time and breeding time horizon. It's good to have a balance of within and between family selection. Nobody really, 50 or fewer parents is going to be sufficient for any program in a realistic time scenario. Probably many fewer is perfectly sufficient. Critically, I mean, we do, and in general, if you're using proper genomic selection, predicting the future from historical data, it generally is economical in plant. In crop systems, due to allowing you to recycle earlier, but you need to make sure you really optimize the program to get the benefits. And this is the key point. If you're doing genomic prediction in crops, if you do it in everybody wants to optimize, but you need to have all the logistics in place before you start. You do need a suitably large, sufficient related training population, and you must ensure high data quality, because there's a lot of ways that phenotypic and genotypic data can have errors, and if you're accumulating enough errors and you're using this, so there's more steps in it. You've got to get your genotypic data and your phenotypic data quality up. There's more steps to go wrong, and if you're doing data-driven breeding, and maybe your margins, it's only slightly better to use genomic prediction, and it saves you only a little bit of resources, but if you have a lot of error, you lose the benefits. Okay. This is my personal viewpoint on data quality, and I think most people would agree, versus methodology. So, these are what are important. You have efficient trial designs integrated with the downstream analysis. You really focus on quality. Every step where you can introduce an affordable QA/QC step, you do it to minimize error. As I said earlier, if you've got 5 or 10% germplasm error, even if you're a commercial company using barcoding at every step, you're going to get that. 5 to 10% germplasm error through a program is a well-run breeding program with very careful work. There is some non-technical genotype, not genotype technique error. There's some probably a real genotype error is to be expected, but the approaches in genotype QC, you can avoid that, and I think we can get that number very low, but we must use the relevant QC approach. And if you're going to make it work, have your targets, have it very focused. It's clear, transparent breeding workflow in a QG framework that's optimized. If you optimize it, if you do your simulation, this is what I need to do. You can't really deviate that much from that there. You can deviate a bit, and it's not totally inflexible. We all have to be flexible. Things go wrong, but you need to keep that focus. This is more important. So you go to the literature, there's thousands of genomic prediction methods. My method gives you a 1% increase in 4 of the 7 data sets I looked at. My method does this, my method does this. Some of these have no value to breeding because they're not put in a breed, they're theoretical. Some have good value, and there are things we can do, incorporating environmental covariates and so forth, which are going to improve your prediction. Get this right using the core approaches like GBLUP and basic methodology. And yeah, it's great. You can have a 1% increase in accuracy by using a slightly different method, but that's the icing on the cake. Got to get the cake sorted first. So there's a lot of excitement on new technology, new this, new technology, that. You can't do it without the core parts. And this was a quote from a colleague here when I was having this discussion with the readers, and he's like, guys, you're building a high-speed railway, you first have to build a long straight track. You need this core part in place. So my view is, I'm a quantitative geneticist, I'm going to read lots of papers on new methods, but really the new methods are, the standard methods work well, new methods might be an improvement, but that's not the focus. The focus is this, get this right first, then improvement. So, if you know the genetic diversity in your population, trial heritability and your costs, you can model the logistics of your program, find the best way to increase genetic gain. That's the summary of that. And genomic prediction is really, at its core, the concept is fairly straightforward. You're borrowing information from relatives, or you're calculating information across different marker alleles that you have. They both produce the same result, and they're a way of including extra information that helps you do other things in the program. We're going to get into details of the maths and methodology, and that's a bit more complicated, but at core, it's not. It's part of your breeding toolkit, and the core is fairly straightforward. I said I was going to talk about genetic gain. Let me just see what time it is. What time is it, by the way? 11:40. Okay, I'm running ahead of time. So when we want to look at it, we need to assess genetic gain. So this is just a terminological thing. We have expected and realized genetic gain. Expected is what you get when you use the breeder's equation to see how much genetic gain you can achieve. So we can do simulations, but even in a simple case, you can do this simply. So we've got a second stage of testing. We evaluate 1,000 materials in 5 environments. We take best 10%. So we have the parameters we need. So we know that so we've got the original population phenotypic mean. We have the phenotypic variance. So the square root of that is phenotypic standard deviation. We've got the genotypic and error variances and standard deviation. We've got the heritability. Let's say it's 0.5 here. And we have the selection intensity we can work out. And then we can calculate the selection differential from that, which is 2.48. And then we can calculate the expected response to selection. We can say it's either the heritability times the selection differential, or it's the intensity, which we can calculate square root of the heritability, and we set this genetic variance to 1 here. And you get the same answer, 2.4. So after one cycle, you're going to have gone from a mean of 5 that we started with here to 6.24. And if the cycle takes 5 years, the genetic gain per year is 0.248. We can just do simple or more complicated simulations over time. The realized genetic gain is what you actually achieve. So we need time representative samples of germplasm. So if you're looking at the end of the cycle, it could be I release this variety in 2024. Or if you're looking at earlier stages, this is a stage 2 in 2024. when we evaluate. We can do, there's two ways to do it. We use the historical data, evaluating material that was produced at whatever stage you're interested in each year. Or we can say, let's take the last 20 years. This would only be done if you're using really late stage material. Let's say we'll take the best 5 lines we released over each year over the last 20 years, plant them all together and see how well they do now. There are caveats with this because disease can change quite a lot in that time. So if you want to measure yield in a combined trial, it can be quite badly affected by disease. This is not a good slide, I don't think you can read this. So this is the ERA trial. So your coverage is going to be low because you can't grow that many varieties, but you've got really good connectivity because you've got everything you need in the same trial. If you're looking at historical data, your coverage can vary, but your connectivity among the entries depends on having a check strategy. So if you want to see how well a variety did in a particular year, how well your varieties in 2024 did compared to 2020, you need something that are grown in 2020 that are also grown in 2024. You need a check strategy. Because the fewer checks, you can't connect the years or understand how things have changed without growing the same lines each year. And your check strategy, you need different number of checks depending on what stage you're looking at. But in general, if you've got like a 6-year breeding cycle, it'd be good to have 6 checks at the late stage. And each year you go through this, you want your checks to be up to date because if the check gets knocked out by disease, you've not got a comparison anymore. So essentially what you want to do with checks is have enough, and then every year you replace the oldest check with a new one. Or maybe a bit more ad hoc than that if a disease destroys your check, you've got to do it. So often what the outputs of breeding programs submit, often there has been no check strategy, for example, and so it's quite hard to estimate the gain you've had, especially if you're going to be relying on one check, and that check can do better in some years than other years. It's the same as any other variety. You need enough checks to average out how well they've done over time. And that way, if you have that good check strategy, you can measure your genetic gain per year quite easily using the historical data. In general, I've found that if you look at very late stage, in our case, the stage 4 versus the stage 2 in wheat, the numbers are actually fairly consistent. I don't know in maize, but what you did at stage 4, is that right one? Genetic gain?
Not just stage 4,
Yeah.
and on-farm.
And on-farm.
The results.
There is, yeah. But you do need a good check strategy, and as Juan just said, on-farm is in many ways can be the best way, but has some. But I just want to emphasize that realized genetic gain is actually measuring how well you've done. That's what we talk about.
In an aspect question related to this check strategy, was you find that you run a program for 4, 5 seasons or years, and you drop it. That linkage can be good.
Yeah, but if you...
How then you want to have that kind of overlap going forward?
So the overlap is let's say you use 6 checks, and each check you use for 6 years, so you've always got an overlap of at least 5 between adjacent years. I mean, it will taper off after a while, but as long as you have interconnectivity between adjacent years, you can do it.
And then the next question would be the proportion of our candidates relative to checks and how much we are using in terms of resources.
It's the absolute number of checks that matters.
Yeah, I mean,
So you can, if you say,
there's a chain of aspects that I'm talking about, in terms of numbers,
yeah,
check relative to candidate.
I think, well, the checks it's just an absolute number, so I wouldn't want to go less than 4 checks. Doesn't matter how many candidates you have. Because then you won't be able to make the estimate.
Yeah, it was a problem. What I was saying, when we want to analyze the historical data, you may have local check, commercial check, whatever, but they wanted that connectivity check. We connected all the trials in I don't know how many years.
Yeah. So this is a strategy going forward, but yeah, I understand the back data, you don't often have that. And if you don't have that, your estimates are kind of...
Exactly.
We've done some Angular work, worked on some simulations, but it's very sensitive to... The genetic gain estimate is quite sensitive to checks and other check connectivity and other issues. You have to be careful with the interpretation. Because actually you need more data. Generally you need more data than you think you need. And certainly going back in time, it can be very difficult. I mean, what you need to look at is where you, firstly, if you have a lot of data and you've got a consistent result. So you can make the estimate of genetic gain, and if you have sufficient populations to do that from, you really do find, I don't know an example here, but you have a fairly clear, if you look at everything, you'll see, you've got a cluster here, cluster moving up, and you've got lots of data. You can say, well, that's a robust data set. If you have not enough populations and that interacts with not enough checks, you just tweak one thing and the whole thing gives you a different answer. And so when you're interpreting this, including in all the CG portals where you're just putting a number, I think you really need to be careful to say how reliable something is. And the reliability can be how many files per test were looked at each year. Was it 10, was it 5, was it 20? But also the check strategy might come into that. There's a lot of context dependency in the results, and a lot of the time it's not very robust. In an ideal quantitative genetics world, you'd have, like in wheat, where given our G by E levels, you need 10 in-TP files per year as a minimum. We don't often have that, we produce the results, but they're not super reliable. But going forward, we need a proper check strategy.
No, like you're putting it in terms of your planning going forward.
Yeah.
How are you handling it? And how would you want it to?
Yeah. Going forward, 5 or 6 checks. Even if you're only running 4 lines, well, maybe not. Maybe 4 lines. If you're only testing 4 lines, maybe that's overkill. But I think you need enough checks to make a robust calculation, and you need enough files. I think in maize you have enough files, but your checks are more difficult. In wheat we suffer from not enough files as well as checks. That was a quick overview, probably quicker than I intended, because I finished early. Are there any other questions on any of these topics that we can discuss now? Because the next step is going to get more into the details of the maths. This is an overview, make sure we're all thinking along the same lines and the underlying strategies we use.
Thank you. I have just 2 questions. One is the simulation. How close are the simulation and the reality? If you close or you do the simulation and then come to the reality, how close are these?
How close the population?
Yes. And the second one on the selection index. When you talk about selection index, in the early stage, but when I come to the ready stage, I'm just going to use the minimum ratio, like the selection in the productive profile, or also supposed to use the selection?
So the first question, usually the simulations are going to be run in a closed population. And we make the assumption if your population is mostly closed, that's okay. You can run simulations of how to optimize your introgression and pre-breeding as well, but in general, they are assuming close population, which has caveats. The second, in general, that means the results do hold even if it's not fully closed. Selection index should really, is only meant for use for selecting parents at the recycling stage. So you wouldn't really use the selection index for the product profile, for the product development, because the selection index is the cross-trait profile and it doesn't take account of thresholds. So the selection index is recommended only for the parental selection stage. So you use it once per pipeline per year to help you select the best parents.
Another question is the check. Okay. When I go to the later stage, also you are advised to use maybe the minimum for check on the later stage activities to check is okay?
It's still better to use 4, because in any trial, it's the same as any trial. If you use 2 checks, the checks interact with the environment. So there is a G by E effect on the checks as well. So you're going to distort your result. If you only use 1 or 2 checks, you really want an average across a number of checks to keep that stable. So that 1 check, like in the trials that I think you both, Juan and I, have worked on with Simic Durham meat, they've used 4 checks for like 3 decades. But one of those checks in some years can have a big dropout. And if you look at the gain across that year, by including or not including that check, it completely changes the answer. Because that 1 check in that year, for whatever reason, we don't know what it is, there was probably some general, maybe it was a dry year across many sites or whatever that check, performed poorly across many trials in that year. So everything in that year, it pulls down the overall check mean in that year. So it looks like there was a really good year for variety production when it really just the check went back. So you're trying to have enough checks that you average out any check by year effect. That's why you need the high numbers. So, and that, every variety, I mean, you want your checks to be as stable across years as possible, but you can't guarantee that, so you need to average across them.
I want to make a follow-up related to your answer. Say that within the selection index, can't I use selection indices for product selection if I'm having different environments? Like in maize, I do optimum, I do drought, I do low end, I do whatever. Then I select that I put indices for those for selection and advancement of product.
It's still the, so if those are different pipelines, you use a different selection.
Yeah, but evaluating the same products in different environments.
It's still better if you're developing products to use the thresholds. You can maybe augment it with the index, but your index is really telling you what makes the best parents. That's the aim of the index.
Probably the point is, what is a selection index? In the theory of selection index is for population improvement, because we are working, or we are using to build the index using genomic variants, genetic correlations, heritability, etc. So at later stage, when we have a few number of hybrid or variety, the problem is that those components doesn't make so much sense. The genetic variants of my best 10 hybrids, what is this? Is it a genetic variant or not? The heritability also, what is the meaning of heritability of my best 10 hybrids? In that point of view, is what we are saying selection index is not for advancement. In the other side, we can build any kind of index because we are improving 4 or 5 traits depending on our product target. And based on those specific traits, we don't consider heritability, genetic variance, phenotypic correlation, we can build a simple index, like in GD, here, 18.2. They just rank everything and calculate the mean of the ranks. This is helpful to have a decision, because based on this simple average, I can solve my genotype and say, we are talking about 20, 25 values, no more than that. Then we can sort them, and based on this index, okay, those are the best. But I will see also the individual traits. We can
So basically, we're saying it's not a selection index in the true set.
it's not a selection index in the technical point of view.
It's a selection threshold or something.
It's a selection, call whatever you want.
It's an index that you have developed for.
For
It's a-
select candidates to advance.
It's an index that you have developed yourself to decide how to evaluate products. But a selection index with all the theory behind it is to decide the parent to decide. I guess, yeah, it is an index, but it's your index.
You can also change from state to state, right? Like state 1, you can use that ranking, but state 3, I can deploy all sorts of indexes for the finance. The same, I want to rate also considering check. Like 7 checks are called states, or you do more checks at the last stage, less checks at the early stage of evaluation.
In some ways, you might want to do more checks at that stage, but it's at a finite stage.
Okay. If I am following this conversation, is there the whole point here is that at the population development stage, these concepts are very important. Selection intensity, genetic gain. But once we have a product that we are trying to advance, so at the early stage, late stage, variety registration, these concepts are no longer relevant. Is it okay if I have this kind of clarity?
That is clarity.
Or it's not as simple as what we are as you are discussing now, because I'm not following it.
It is, in a way, it's as simple. What we are discussing are concepts of population improvement. Some of, you might use some of the same ideas for product development, but product development is based on, it's crop dependent, program dependent. You have got to the point where you've outputted some things from when you've thrown out, it's going to go back up one way to find this, I guess. We're talking about the selection indices and all the stuff in this population. You throw out something here for development.
Yes.
You have targets in that are crop and program specific. And you can make an index and you can maybe say, well, actually the maths in some of the maths in here is useful for making an index here. But it's not universal like the processes here. The things we're going to talk about mostly in this class, in this course, are kind of universal concepts we use in here. Some of the same principles might apply here. So it's not saying we can't use anything from here, but what we're talking about is correctly, as you said. We're talking about the concepts we use here, and maybe some variants from that are useful here. And maybe, it can help here to have some genomic information, but it's not as critical as it is here. It doesn't achieve the same thing. You wouldn't produce genomic information only for this, except maybe on specific markers or specific traits you must have in a product. But doing a mid-density genotyping on the product is not something that's useful. But some of the outputs from that you could use help you make your product development decision.
Still follow-up question on the check, especially in the later stage. Every stage they understand that they have many check and they can have many lines to test.
Yep.
But in the early stage, can you help us as the representative genetics? Maybe if you do simulation, if we have 20 lines to test, how many checks is needed? If we have maybe 25 Because from what I see, the drug will be more with checks than entry test.
Yeah, we can't, it depends what you're doing. If you're calculating genetic gain, I think you need, you have fewer than, well, in all stages, if you're down to 1 or 2 checks, you're taking a risk that they're not representative. That's the core baseline. I know there's different kinds of checks as well. There's connectivity checks, there's local control checks to see how well you're doing against known varieties and stuff. All of those come in. I'm just talking about the connectivity checks need to be a certain minimum to avoid lines to overcome the genotype by year or genotype environment. Would you, Juan, do you want to? I think Juan's going to comment on that.
Yeah, before you comment, can you add more light on this connectivity check? Is it that it's connected by the ancestry, half seed, full seed, or is it connectivity?
Oh, sorry, I'm now getting into complicated terminology. With the genetic gain estimation, the connectivity check is how many checks overlap between years. It's how you connect. So if I want to know how well something did in 2023 compared to 2022, I need to have enough checks that are in common between years to establish that. That's a connectivity check in genetic gain.
Instead of in 2024, I use this check, 2025, I use a different check.
Then you can't.
If I use consistent check, that's a connectivity check.
Yes.
All right.
That's a connectivity check for genetic gain. Yeah. But then there's the issue of how many checks you use in a year within a trial to make sure, and that relates to the connectivity checks as well. If you only have 2 connectivity checks, you say, well, I've had them in all the years, but some years one of those checks has a negative interaction with the environment. You're not really establishing a consistent baseline across years.
So I can drop it and pick the one that's consistent. Or I can
If one starts behaving erratically, you
because
drop
it's not
it.
giving me the right basis to compare.
Yeah, but you only know it's behaving erratically because you've got 4 other checks that are stable. That's why you have to have 5. Who next?
Question number.
Juan, do you want
I
to?
don't know if, okay, mine is a question. As we are now having clear separation between population movement and rural development, are we going to calculate the genetic gains twice? The first at the end, recycling the population improvement, and also because advisable to have genetic gain at the late stage, or sometimes even taking on genetic gain on farmers' field and other things.
That's a really good point. Yeah. What do you want to measure? I think we have to have a late stage to see how you're doing in farmers' fields or stations that represent farmers' fields. But it can be useful if you're doing a breeding program to see how well you're doing in stage 1 or stage 2. So both of those, and I found, and I think this is what Juan and I mentioned, I found they were fairly, surprisingly consistent. I expected it not to be consistent when I looked at it, and they were reasonably consistent. But it's good to have both. I actually don't know what the CG recommendation is. Do you guys know? For when you measure genetic gain, do we want just late or also early?
Only later stage.
It only has to be later stage, but early stage is extra information.
The idea is, even if you are doing good population improvement, if you are not able to do good trialing to make that gain realized in the field,
Yeah.
that's why it's a KPI. Because then it comes from your trialing capability, how you are doing trialing, and as a base question, like the checks, I think we'll explain there are different kinds of checks for people. But what we was talking, like in graduate drop program, we agreed for 3 genetic gains, not 6.
How do you think?
Yeah, like to start now, and we see how they interact. We suggested to take some very stable kind of variety, like so that GY effect can, but it's a topic of discussion. So we agreed for as of previous 3 or maximum 4 genetic gains. All of them, your breeding check, disease check, commercial variety, that's your choice. That you are the boss to choose. But for estimating genetic gain, we want each year. So this is a statistical requirement, otherwise we cannot pull those, so we can pull still, but better pulling of an activation. We need those checks.
As you are saying, which means that even those checks, selection of those checks will be based on data. If I can understand.
Yeah, you need to cite the checks.
Okay.
We ask readers which checks you think are good and provide the data. You don't collect ourselves. We take data.
But if you've been doing the estimation for 3 years and you see one of the checks is up and down all over the place.
For population improvement, we compare cycle 0, cycle 1, cycle 2, cycle 3. You measure the progress we make. Like the genetic gain between cycle 0 and cycle 4, let's say. That's the genetic is very pretty straightforward. And therefore for the product development, the way we was explaining, we need to have a genetic check, local check, commercial check, connectivity check. All of those things have to be there. And we use that for genetic gain calculation, the genetic check. For all the checks, like up to 4 years.
I know it seems weird if you have 4 lines and you have 4 checks, but the checks do provide, you need that information from the checks. It's not the proportion, it's the absolute number of checks. So even if you have 100 lines, 4 to 6 checks is fine. It's not how many. It's not the proportion; it's the absolute number. Because we just don't want to be relying on 1 or 2 checks. One.
Yeah, it was already said, and maybe point one is, when you ask how many checks depending on the size of the population, the answer, you will not be happy with the answer, because the answer will be 50 checks. And nobody, no, 50. 5 0. 5 0. No, nobody will use this number. And this will happen in most of the cases when you are selected. If we want to do the good right, or the right numbers, number of replicas, number of children, number of locations, usually the numbers exceed the possibilities, the practical, the physical, and financial possibility.
I can't go back now because I've lost the.
This is one. The other thing is the spatial checks also. Yeah, an additional kind of check we can use. And the point is, more than the number, it's more important the kind of checks we are using. Because what we want to, for genetic gain, to estimate the effect of the year and the interaction between years and location and the genotypes, and also for spatial analysis, what we need is a checks that respond to the environment, that is able to capture the environmental variability that affect real year. Stable, but in the sense of the hydrogen process, with the slope is 1. Yes, because this is what happens in wheat. They use 3 or 4 checks that are very stable, and it doesn't matter where you put them, they eat the same. Those checks are not useful, because you cannot capture environmental effect.
Yeah, you need to arrange.
3, 4, 5 checks, no more than that. Because you will not spend so many budget on checks.
And that's happening in the breeding program as well. The wheat program gives us 3 checks that are all the same, so it doesn't help you. It doesn't. You need your checks to cover the same range of variation, more or less, as the actual lines do. And so if you have a check you've been using for years as well, like Juan said, once it's actually, if the check's running at 4 tons per hectare and your trial's now running at 7, it's kind of pointless. It doesn't help. You need them to be in the right range as well. And I was just, I didn't say it as much, but this is what Wayne was basically just saying, and the answer to the question earlier, how much you did. Actually, in your early testing, you would need more checks, theoretically. But we, for the same reason we just said, that's not going, that doesn't fly as well. But actually, you would be, if your breeding site, you need a reasonably large number in early testing. From a statistical point of view.
Am I seeing 2N to 3N?
You are. So we're saying if your breeding cycle is 4 years, maybe 4 checks in replace every year, but if in your early testing you want to get 10 or 12 checks. But like Juan said, you guys aren't going to do that. So. But we have it.
But let me can I ask, if we are pushing the limit for what's a check to be as close as possible to the line, then that check is also good. Is that possible? I mean, realistically, is that possible to have that good check?
At least here in Latin America, what we are talking about is that it is better to put all the data we can find as suggest to repeat some lines or some genotype in different years. Using check, you can put, I don't know, percentage, 10%, something like that you repeat 2 years at least. And then the link between years is mainly the success of your check. That probably will work better than the check. Is that more expensive also?
And it's a pain in the bum for the analysis because you have to treat them in slightly different ways when it comes in the second year.
But this is only to estimate genetic gain.
Yeah, this is
not a main effect of your type, so probably we need to know if that's a good practice or not. The other thing is that at the early stage, we are using the GRM genetic relation. The role of the checks is not so important because we can leave the data in here using the map.
So, if the next question that somebody asks from that is, if you're doing genetic gain analysis, why don't you use the GRM? The answer is technical. We did try it, and it didn't work. It's not the easiest. So, when Eduardo tried to block and then de-block it, and it didn't work. But we can come to that later if we need to have the discussion, but it is. Technically, for the genetic gain, we can't use the GRM very effectively to make the genetic gain analysis. But as Juan said, for other trials, you can. But I was mainly focusing on genetic gain, where we need those connectivity checks between the year. But yeah, we can't use the GRM very easily in genetic gain. Due to some technical limitations. Abhishek.
I and Fernando were also talking something like this. Laws like few things are statistically possible. That biologically they may not make much sense. That you should do this or not. Using a GRM, sometimes you may connect, you may establish connectivity. But probably escorting environmental variation may not make very different. So they have not common. We would several kind of checks.
So yeah, you can't shortcut the checks in your genetic gain analysis.
It's not that difficult.
Yeah. I mean, some things, are statistically fantastic, but logistically don't work. But there are, in the other way around, some things that you guys might know, well, that should be statistically easy, turns out not to be. Did you have another comment on that? Okay. So that's, we can have, I think, you'll probably talk about checks more when you talk about trial design. When you do your trial design, you're going to talk a bit more about checks.
Oh, yeah.
So that discussion will come in more detail later for non-genetic gain. This is an overview of the points. Okay, any more questions or shall we go for lunch? So I will try and put a table here to put books on and stuff this afternoon.
Yeah.
My preference is we go through the talks first and then I give you them later. That can also enable me to, I have them here, but to add or do things. But I guess, does everybody want that? I mean, who wants the material in advance?
I always prefer getting them in advance, but you said you prefer giving them later.
Yeah, but you're the paying clientele. You can decide if you want.
Later on.
I prefer later.
Later,
You ask him more questions, because if you read, you're not asking more questions, you're already discussing more.
Whether you read or you don't read, you okay, you still ask questions. Having it ahead of time will prepare you. I'm telling you, others, even if you send it ahead of time, if you read it, some will still won't read it. Because